The official viewing clock says it's 1:30, so let us begin. Welcome to another edition of the SSD Thursday seminar.
Friday.
That's why Andy took over my place. Okay, my name is Arnel. I'll be your moderator today. I'm scheduled to give the seminar, but Andy graciously accepted the on my behalf what do you call it? Slot, yes, because I'm too tired. Anyway, today, Dr. Andy Nelson will give you a background on the RIICE project, that is RIICE. He is the Deputy Director General. Sorry, Development Project Manager. He just handed this over to me one couple of minutes ago. Okay, so that should get the icebreaker, so to speak. Anyway, he'll give a background on what the project is, the objectives, the partners, the expected outputs, and some of the lessons learned after 1 year of activities. So without much further talk, and I might make another mistake, I'm handing this over to Andy.
Thank you, Arnel, for a unique introduction. I guess you can hear at the back. This project's been running for about a year now, and I realized all too late that not only had I not given an SSD seminar in over 3.5 years of being in the division, that's not first. I also realized I'd never really given an overview of this project. And it was, time was due to do this, particularly since I think half of the GIS lab at least has now been roped into the RIICE project. It's turned into a bit of a beast. And originally it was myself and Tree, Jorel, a bit of Arnel's time, and I think just about everyone now is somehow contributing to it as it's become bigger and bigger. It's not just IRRI, there are a lot of partners in this project, and I just want to acknowledge some of them here. I've probably forgotten a few as I try to put this together today, because it's something that's grown from about 7 or 8 partners to about 20 or 30 now, and it's probably going to get bigger as the project goes on. But just to make sure I acknowledge everyone from IRRI who's contributed, I'm particularly grateful to Phil Rice, who've done a lot of the work I'm going to be showing later, as I give some examples from the Philippines. But we've also got a lot of other partners, public and private sector. I'll talk about the project in general. I'm going to tell you all again about remote sensing. I think you've been to enough SSD remote sensing GIS seminars, but I'm always going to put 1 or 2 slides in as a kind of brief reminder of what we do. And then I'm going to talk about some examples from the Philippines. The great thing about the RIICE project, it keeps on getting bigger and bigger. So I wasn't going to just do 1 seminar, but now we're going to have 3. This is the first one. Tree, who's going to give the second one on yield estimation, and Arnel will be back to do the 3rd seminar on WebGIS when he's not quite so jet-lagged from traveling. That's why I'm doing this today, to take his place. And it actually makes sense for me to give the first one, talking about some of the most basic products and giving you an overview of the project, and then we'll go into the more detailed seminars later on in the year. So I'll talk about that. I will really focus on example products from the RIICE project, what we've done so far, how good the products are, and some of my observations on working in a quite complicated public-private partnership project. It's difficult to say, and it's even difficult to implement. Bit of a background. Some of the questions we get asked in the GIS and remote sensing group. This comes up all the time. People want to know how much rice has been planted, what was the yield, was production better or worse than last year, was the harvest early or late, was there any kind of natural catastrophe, how much was lost, how much was affected. And these are questions we get a lot. And it can happen pretty much in any country that IRRI or GRIICE now is working. And often it's very difficult for us to try and answer these questions. And so kind of RIICE came out of that. How can we deliver this kind of information? And we started thinking about what do we actually know about RIICE. These are some of the questions, some of the things we couldn't answer, but I wanted to start from what do we actually know before we try to answer these questions. The first thing we know is that it's a very valuable crop. This is a map I like showing a lot. Maybe we could turn the lights down. I'll show this map a lot because this is a map that a lot of people can relate to. This map is just showing money. I think we can all relate to money. All I've done here is color code all the agricultural areas of the world. And the color coding represents the value of the crop production in that area. So anything in bright yellow or white are hugely productive agricultural areas, where the value of that crop is more than $10,000 per hectare, on average, per year. So you can see these hugely important agricultural production areas. And if you add it all up across all the crops in the world, it's about $1 trillion every year. Big numbers. If you just look at rice, most of the world goes dark, but Asia stays this kind of nice glowing yellow color. This is where all the rice is produced. And again, you still see it's hugely valuable. Plenty of areas where rice is a major component of the overall agricultural productivity. Rice on its own is about $150 billion every year. It's grown on about 160 million hectares by about 200 million farmers. All big numbers. And the RIICE project is all about insurance. That's potentially a huge market. And how many of those rice farmers are actually insured? About that many. Not many at all. Huge potential for crop insurance in areas, even though it's a very challenging developing market. What else do we know about rice? We know that not only is it produced in Asia, it's largely consumed in Asia too. And this is one of my slides that Bob keeps stealing, but it's my slide, not his. Rice consumption per capita, anything in dark green, is where rice consumption is extremely high. There are some few areas in Africa and Latin America where consumption is as high as Asia, but in general, Asia is where rice is consumed the most. And it's also the area where poverty incidence is extremely high. We always talk about Africa as being an extremely poor continent. Absolutely true. It is. But the sheer density of people in Asia means that when you start to count the number of poor, there are more poor in Asia than there are in Africa, simply because of the population density. 90% of the world's rice is produced and consumed in Asia, and about 70% of the world's poor are also in Asia. Not only do we know where it's grown, we know when it's grown. We're working with remote sensing to try and work out, for any given time of the year, where we find rice. People grow rice at all sorts of different times, because the climate allows them to do so, and the water availability allows them to do so. And so they do. And here you can just see as we cycle through the months, even looking just at Luzon, different areas producing rice at different times. And this is a real challenge when it comes to crop insurance. The exposure to risk, the exposure to hazard, is different in different places at different times. Even over quite small distances, you can see variability in when people are actually planting. We also know it's an extremely vulnerable crop. Poor Philippines gets hit by more tropical storms than just about any other country in the world. It's also part of the global flood hazard hotspot, South and Southeast Asia. And if you look at all the different kind of hazards we get, and then you come up with a kind of economic loss of all those hazards, again, Asia, as well as other areas, is a pretty big hotspot, vulnerable economically to these natural catastrophes. Most of the rice in Asia is grown in the wet season. It's vulnerable to flood, wind, storm damage. Drought can also be an issue if the rain comes late. And there's definitely an opportunity to develop crop insurance solutions in this area. And that's what RIICE is all about. Before I go into RIICE in detail, crop insurance, a bit of terminology, because when I started this project, I didn't know anything about crop insurance. And people kept on using these terms like indemnity and index-based insurance. And these are the two common types of crop insurance that you can obtain. Indemnity is the most common one, and the one that people are most familiar with. If your car is insured, or if your house is insured, it's an indemnity-based insurance. You're insuring a particular object or a particular area. So if your farm is covered by indemnity-based insurance and there's a flood, and you lose your crop in your field, you'll be covered. The other type of insurance is an index-based insurance. And this is something that's a lot easier for the insurance company to implement because they just take information from perhaps a weather station and then record the rainfall, and they decide on a trigger. And they say, okay, if there's 20 days with no rainfall, we will pay out to every farmer within 10 kilometers of this weather station because we think that they've got a drought problem. They're not actually measuring the damage of the field. It's not like this. They're not measuring the loss of the actual. They're actually measuring an index and saying, is that index beyond our trigger or our threshold? If so, we pay out. Weather index is one. Area yield is another. So you could look at an irrigation area or a municipality and say, what's the average yield? And all the farmers who are insured, if their yield that year didn't meet that trigger, you would pay out to all insured farmers without actually measuring their loss. Same thing. Remote sensing is also used, usually looking at vegetation indices. Does the crop look as healthy as it should based on remote sensing? If it doesn't, we pay out. So it's something that's easy for the insurance company to implement, but it has a lot of risks associated with it. They may be paying out to people who don't need it, because they don't actually measure the loss. This one's got problems because it's really expensive to implement. They have to go and check every single claim. And that's hard when you have to go out into the field and assess every single farmer's loss. So this is the opportunity for RIICE, the RIICE project. How can we come up with better crop insurance products to try and make these types of insurance products more affordable and quicker to implement? From a crop insurance provider's viewpoint, this is the situation. It's a big market. It's $25 billion in premiums every year in crop insurance, but it's an underdeveloped market in developing countries. They see it as a huge potential, but they don't really know how to crack the market. Government support to insurance is huge. There is no single crop insurance product that is running at a profit. They all need a subsidy, and the insurance subsidy can be as much as 50%. So the government might be bankrolling the whole insurance scheme because insurance companies alone can't afford to implement it. They need subsidies and other support. And they're really concerned about the quality issues with information. They need a yield history if they're going to insure somebody on a trigger yield. Where do you get that yield history from, and do you trust it? Do you trust the statistics? This is something we always talk about in SSD. Do you trust the area and production statistics enough to be able to make a financial product and take a risk on insuring people on that trigger threshold? They're also worried about weather-based insurance. If you look at the weather station, it's all too easy for somebody to manipulate the weather station figures. And they've seen this happen in several countries where the weather station data has been manipulated to trigger a payout. And crop insurance usually runs at a loss. But the reason why the insurance companies are interested is because it opens the doors for them to get other products out. Once a farmer is insured, once that farmer becomes known to the bank because he has some low-cost insurance, the bank could then offer him other products. It's like you're a known customer. I trust you now. You're already part of the banking system. We can offer you other credit, other loans, because we already know you as a customer. So this is one of their kind of entry points. Crop insurance will never make money. It will never be a profit maker for the insurance companies, but it gives them, the lenders, and the other reinsurers access to a bigger market for further products on top of the crop insurance. Looking at an end user viewpoint, most rice farmers are generally poor. Their livelihoods are quite marginal. They're extremely vulnerable to natural catastrophes. They don't have access to credit in many cases. Crop insurance is often viewed as being simply not available, too expensive, we don't trust it anyway, and some people who've had insurance say the payout is too slow. By the time you assess my loss, by the time you work out the damage, it's 6 months later, it's too late. You know, I just lost my crop, I haven't had any income, I'm screwed, basically. So they don't like that long-term payout system. They want it to be quick. They need money from a catastrophe and they need it very quick. So from a research and development viewpoint, that's our opportunity, that's where we come in. We know how to use remote sensing and crop modeling to map and monitor rice. The challenge for us is to do it quickly, to do it in an operational way, to make it transparent, to make it reliable, and to get confidence in the system. And all of these issues need to be addressed within the RIICE project. Better and quicker estimates, reliability, reduced costs, and training and education. Getting people who are going to implement this to do it, not really. We have to kind of transfer the technology to those who are actually going to run this kind of insurance scheme. So finally, slide 15, the RIICE project, what's it all about? Remote sensing-based information and insurance of crops in emerging economies. That's our RIICE acronym. It's a public-private partnership. We're trying to develop technologies that are useful for rice crop monitoring and damage estimation. And clearly that goes beyond crop insurance. It's not only the crop insurance companies who would be interested in that kind of information. We need to demonstrate low-cost and timely insurance solutions. We need to build partnerships and networks to deliver that to those who need it. And one of the biggest challenges is getting government-level support for this, because you can't just come up with an insurance product and roll it out. You need a huge network, a huge distribution channel that needs to be ratified and approved by the government before you can have this kind of insurance product on the market. So there's a lot of work involved in going from remote sensing to farming. These are the people involved. IRRI's responsibility in the project is to calibrate and validate the yield estimation and to work with the national partners who do the field monitoring, and to develop what's called a web GIS, which Arnel will be talking to you about later in the year in his segment. The web GIS is a way for us to get the information out to the insurers and the other partners. So they can go online, get all the maps, get all the yield estimates, and they can use that in their insurance system to develop, to assess the risk and the loss, etc. Sarmap has been one of our long-term strategic partners in remote sensing. They developed the software for doing all the analysis. Allianz is the insurance partner. They're working with us to develop these new insurance products. GIZ, the German development agency, is working on the distribution networks, getting the products out there. And the Swiss Development Corporation are the ones really funding it, but also doing some knowledge management of the product. What's really important is that within each country where we're working, we have national partners on the ground who are helping us to, with expert knowledge, baseline data, field work and monitoring. So these are the people out in the field doing all the hard work to kind of validate and calibrate our area estimates, our yield estimates, when did the season start, when did the season end, things like that. The RIICE project has sites in 7 countries. India with Tamil Nadu, Agricultural University. We hope to work in Bangladesh with BARC, but that hasn't started yet. We work in Thailand with the RIICE department, in Cambodia with CARGI, in Vietnam with Canto University in the south and UMen in the north, with IRRI in Indonesia and Java, and with RIICE in 3 sites in the Philippines. So we've got a lot of sites where we're demonstrating this technology. The reason why we have this huge number of sites is because if you want to develop an insurance product, and if you want to demonstrate to the national governments and the national insurance systems that this technology works, you really have to demonstrate it in that country. And if I go with some examples from the Philippines to Thailand, they're just not going to buy it. You have to show them in an area that they know, in an area that they're already operating some insurance, so that they can do a comparison, build trust and confidence, and then think about implementing that in the future. So this is actually really challenging for us to manage, to have this number of sites where it's a very different geography for the technology to work in, but it's also very difficult in the kind of distribution channels and the government legislation It's so different from country to country. So it's a challenge on the technology side and also on the distribution side. If I try to give the whole project in one slide, going from technology to delivery, it looks like this. We're using satellite technology to observe what's going on in the field. We work with our partners to actually monitor in the field as well, so what we see from space is the same as what we see on the ground. We try to calibrate that. We link that to our crop model, and we use it to estimate and forecast rice yields. And that's pretty much where IRRI's task ends, the kind of technology part. This is the really challenging part, I think, is that once you have that information, the insurer has to decide how to use it to develop better insurance products to cover farmers' shortfalls in production. They also need to develop the distribution channels, and that could be lending banks, cooperatives, rice mills, whatever is the best way for you to deliver that insurance product to that last mile to the farmers. And you have your local insurers selling the product through this distribution network, and someone like Allianz or some other reinsurer backing the whole thing. So that's the kind of the whole project and what we aim to do and why we're doing it. What I'm going to do now is give a quick intro to remote sensing and then give you some examples from year one. Again, this is a slide I always show because things really haven't changed that much since remote sensing 100 years ago was using pigeons with cameras strapped on their bellies. The only thing that's changed is that the birds have become a little bit more expensive, but the principle is exactly the same. You fly over an area and you take a picture. A lot of the remote sensing we've been doing is using what's called optical remote sensing, which is essentially a very expensive digital camera. Sunlight's reflected off the surface of the Earth, comes back up to the satellite, and you get a picture of the Earth. So this is an optical image of some rice fields in Vietnam. And what you can see immediately is a lot of cloud cover, a lot of cloud contamination in the image, which makes it really difficult to monitor, especially in the monsoon season, when most of the rice is grown. This really isn't very useful for saying how much rice has been planted. How much rice was affected by the flood? I don't know, it's still covered in cloud. Big problem. And that's why we use radar remote sensing. It's a slightly different technology. Instead of relying on sunlight from the Earth, from sunlight from the sun, the satellite itself is emitting radar microwave pulses. The good thing about radar is that it can penetrate the cloud. This is essentially how air traffic control works. You wouldn't want to be flying in the clouds if air traffic control didn't work when there's clouds. Same principle, it can penetrate the cloud and give you a representation of what's on the ground. So this is the same image with optical. This is the same location using radar, same day. What we've done here is color coded, so everything in yellow is where rice has been planted. So I can just go back, and you can just pick on a cloudy area and see that there's actually quite a lot of rice in it. So this is how radar essentially gives us a lot more information, particularly in the monsoon season. So how does radar work? It's not quite as straightforward as optical imagery. There's optical imagery like Google Earth and Google Maps. You can just look at it and you can interpret what's there. And you can derive vegetation indices from that. Radars gives a bit more explanation about how it works. What happens at the beginning of the season when the rice field is flooded is that the radar satellite emits pulse radar microwave. But just like a football, if you throw it down that way, it's going to bounce away. It's not going to bounce back to you. So the satellite looks down. The image is black because no signal is bounced back. The signal bounces away, and we don't get anything back. It's a black signal. As soon as the rice crop starts to grow, you get a little bit of signal back. Not everything, a little bit, and the signal becomes a bit brighter. As the rice crop grows, you get more and more signal returned. You start to see this kind of signal coming back. And this allows us to monitor through the season, because by detecting the change in the signal that's returned, the different color coding here, you're actually capturing the different stages of the rice crop through the year. So if you can get an image every 16 days, every 14 days through the season, you can use that and interpret the imagery to tell you what's going on. Give you a status of the crop at any time. In reality, these are 3 radar images taken over a part of Leyte in July, August, September. And what you can see here in particular is in July it's black. The fields have been flooded. In August it's gone to a dark grey, the rice is growing. September, very bright signal. Rice crop is mature, full canopy, so you can really detect the difference throughout the year. And that's essentially what we do from the remote sensing aspect. We take images every 16 days, we interpret that, gives us the status of the crop at any one time. The software we're using to do that is called Mapscape RIICE, developed by sarmap, and that gives us rice area. It tells us when the season started. It tells us the status of the crop at any one time. It can also give us leaf area, which is really important for the crop yield estimation. And if there's a flood or a drought, you can detect that too. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, is this part of this diagram, which is Mapscape RIICE and the projects that it can generate. I'll come back to the rest of it later. Remote sensing is inherently scalable. We can go from national to local scale, so we can take a rice map for the Philippines, and then we can zoom in on a particular area. Later, in this example, start to see the detail in the map. We'll keep going, look at a particular municipality and look at the rice area there. And keep going and look at a particular barangay. And by the time we get to this level, you can start to see the individual fields. So this is the kind of detail you can get from the remote sensing. And what we've done here is color code each field. So this image was taken on June 26th, and the color coding represents the different stages of the crop at that time. So anything in brown is bare soil. Anything in blue is where the fields have been flooded already. So this is kind of the early stage of the season for this particular. I'm going to take you through now a whole season of monitoring, show you the image every 16 days. This is the same image, 26th of June. Most areas, rice crop is in blue, just established. Sorry, just flooded. Fields are just been flooded. Many areas in brown where it's bare soil, still land preparation going on. 16 days later, a lot of those areas that were brown and now blue, they've started flooding. And a lot of those areas that were blue are now green. The crop has been planted, it's in tillering stage. 16 days later, it's pretty much all green. Crop is either tillering or approaching peak vegetation. 16 days later again, and again, and again, until we get to September. What we're starting to see in September is some areas have already harvested, they're in pink. But some other fields, they're still in peak vegetation. Others are in senescence and gold, which is kind of grain filling stage. A lot of variability. So from field to field, you can see huge variation in the crop. One thing you can extract from that is when did everyone start planting? Everyone started at different times, so you can produce images that show you the start date of planting. Was it in June or July, or even moving into August? And this is really important when you want to estimate yield. If you want to run a crop model to estimate the yield, you need to have the start date. When did they plant? Because you want to know the weather for the season. And if you don't get the start date right, you're not going to get the yield estimate right. So getting information on when farmers actually plant is really important. When did the crop reach peak vegetation? This is also an important factor. Again, you can see variability from field to field, and the date here of when the crop actually reached that level of vegetation. One of the things that remote sensing is extremely good at is detecting change. If you have regular images, you can detect the change, and that's how you get this monitoring capability. It's also really good at detecting unexpected change. What happens if you get a flood or a drought that affects the rice crop? And this is where I'd really like to say, wow, look at these wonderful examples of remote sensing capturing flood. Now, unfortunately, in our first season of monitoring, there was no flood, and there was no drought. It's unfortunate for me as a presenter. It's really fortunate for the farmers, It's really fortunate for the insurers. It sucks for me, because I can't show you how flooding and drought would look like in remote sensing. There you go. So I cheated. I used PowerPoint to make a flood. Here's an example. If we have a flood on 12th of July, here's my PowerPoint flood. Now, if we just had a RIICE map, if we just had a map that said, here's RIICE, we would see that 40% of the RIICE area was flooded. Just by counting the pixels, if you like, of how many were affected by flood. But because we're monitoring, because we're getting an image on every 16 days, we don't just know where the RIICE is, we know the stage of the RIICE crop. So when this flood hit, half of those fields haven't even been planted yet. They were still blue. They were still in the flooding stage. So the insurance company isn't going to pay out to those farmers because we haven't even planted the RIICE crop. It's going to pay out to the ones in green because they had a RIICE crop that was damaged. So monitoring is really important. Same thing goes. Imagine we had another realistic PowerPoint flood. I'm going to call this Typhoon PowerPoint. They haven't had that then yet, have you? What happened if you had a flood at this stage of the season? It's the same thing. 60% of the whole RIICE area has been affected, but 25% of them are in pink. They've already been harvested. So again, insurers are really interested in this monitoring capability. So you can see not just how much of the RIICE area is affected, but was there actually a crop in the ground when that calamity hit. So that's the importance of monitoring. If you had a flood on any of these two dates, you can see this is the total area. This is how much was actually affected by the flood. But this is the amount of planted RIICE that was affected. And the difference in your damage estimate is quite significant. If you just looked at this, what area is affected, I'd say 2,000 hectares, but only 1,000 of that was actually planted. So your difference in damage is quite different between the two. This would be if you just had a RIICE map, and this you can get if you're doing monitoring throughout the season. I've talked a lot about remote sensing, but it's really important to do this too. People on the field doing monitoring, telling you what's actually going on, allowing you to validate your observations. The remote sensing has to be validated at the same time that people in the field going out every 16 days telling you something about the status of the crop, giving you and the insurance companies confidence in what you're saying is actually true. So you can imagine taking a sample of 20 fields, and you have your monitoring team who will be going to the same 20 fields. Every time there's a satellite pass throughout the season, they'll be going out and telling you something about what's going on in that field. The flooding stage, establishment stage, pre-flowering, flowering, grain filling, harvesting. And each field's going to have a slightly different caliber. Farmers are doing slightly different things. So you can't just do a small number of sites. You have to have a well-distributed sample of monitoring sites to give you confidence that you're capturing the variability. So regular monitoring is key. Regular monitoring from space and in the field. Validates our products, gives confidence in them. And most importantly is that if you really want to look at flood and drought, you do need to be getting images regularly. A single snapshot like Google Earth or Google Maps isn't going to give it the information you need to make these kind of decisions. So that's the remote sensing side. That tells you the area, tells you when the crop was planted. It doesn't tell you how much. And that's where we come in. IRRI is doing a lot of work with the crop modeling, remote sensing, the RIICE 2000, or crop growth simulation model. It's quite a demanding model. It needs a lot of input. You need to tell it what variety of rice it is. You need to tell it the weather, what's to know about the soil, the nutrients, the establishment date. It needs a lot of information. And if you're working here in IRRI, if you're working in a plot, you can get all that information. You've got technicians to help you. You can study that plot until you know what every single tiller and panicle is doing. You can't do that in the real world. You can't scale that up. So remote sensing kicks in by trying to capture a lot of those variables using remote sensing. Remote sensing can tell you the establishment date, And it can tell you something about the status of the crop. And it can tell you something about the leaf area. And the reason that works is because leaf area and crop status are a proxy for all these other things, like nutrients and soil and management. It's the crop's response to all of those inputs. So you're not measuring these, you're measuring the crop's response to nutrients, the crop's response to the weather, the crop's response to the soil, etc., etc. And because you've captured that proxy, that's enough information for you to use the yield model to estimate yield on a wide area, not just on a single point. So remote sensing will capture a lot of the spatial variability that you couldn't easily do on a large scale. So going back to this diagram, we're working in the field with our partners to collect some information on soil and material management data, but not much. Not much. What we are doing, which is quite time-consuming, is measuring the leaf area. And Arnel and Emma have just come back from Thailand, where they've been telling our partners how to do this monitoring in the field, how to monitor leaf area, how to go out and monitor other aspects of the crop so we can validate our products. And what happens is that we take the data from the remote sensing, which tells us when the crop is established, and we take our field work, and that allows us to estimate what we call leaf area, and I'll talk about that more in detail. Once you've got leaf area, you can put leaf area into the RIICE 2000 model, and you can get extremely accurate yield estimates. Once you've got yield, you've got area, you know production, and you can even start to talk about loss in the event of a flood in the ground. LAI, or leaf area index, is an extremely important variable for us. It's a simple measure of the area of the plant leaf per unit ground area, and it goes anything from 0 up to 7. 7 being an extremely vigorous, robust crop. We've got 7 square meters of leaf area for every square meter of land. So it's a huge amount of biomass there from the rice crop. LAI represents the plant's ability to absorb and use sunlight. It's kind of a predictor for yield. It's not a perfect predictor, otherwise you wouldn't need the crop model, but it's a really important aspect of yield. We measure it in the field with our partners, and then we can make what's called a cloud model to map LAI using a remote sensing imagery. So remote sensing imagery is giving us a measure of the crop status of the biomass. We can compute a model which then turns those maps that I showed you into LAI estimates. The other really important bit of field information is the crop count. We take that at the end of the season, and that's our validation. So once we run our crop estimation, our yield estimation, we can validate it against these crop cuts from different locations. So as I said, we can take leaf area estimates from a small number of sites, maybe 12 sites, and we can use that to calibrate a model and turn our remote sensing maps into leaf area index maps. So for any particular date where you've been observing, you can estimate the leaf area. And this graph is going to explain how valuable that leaf area information really is. This is a typical output graph from RIICE 2000. It's showing a number of things. Days after transplanting on the top axis, starting from -20 when the rice crop is in the nursery. And this is the leaf area of the crop in the nursery. Day 0, you transplant the crop, it has a shock. The crop doesn't like being pulled out of the nursery and put into the field. And then the leaf area increases through the season until about day 50. Maximum vegetation, maximum biomass. And then the crop starts to dry out, and what you're getting there is grain fill. So this line in red here is the yield, the grain being generated every day, until you get a yield of about 6 tons per hectare in this example. The problem here is that we know the actual yield from this location is not fine. So our model's overestimated. The yield that we've got from the model is about 1 ton higher than the actual yield. And one of the issues is because the model is overestimating LAI. So what we do is we take our LAI estimates from the remote sensing. We have remote sensing LAI estimates on different dates. And here we have 2 days. One which is about 30 days after transplanting, and one which is about 50 days after transplanting. And these are our new LAI values for those days. They're quite different from the LAI values from the model. That means we can recalibrate the model. We put that into the model, run it again. The model gives a much more realistic LAI value for the season and gives a much more realistic yield output. Because you've adjusted the LAI down to what it should be, the yield also drops down, close to what it should be. So this is how you use the remote sensing derived LAI estimates to get a much better yield output from the model. So I've talked a lot about the technology. I haven't talked much about the insurance yet. We've been working with partners in Leyte, in the Philippines, on an existing area-based yield index insurance. It's called IRRI, area-based yield, and it's not an indemnity product. It doesn't provide payout to individual farmers based on their individual loss. It's an area-based system, so for a particular national irrigation system, they'll estimate the average yield, and they'll say to the farmer, if you buy this insurance, we will measure the average yield of this irrigated area, and if the average yield is below our trigger, we will pay out to you. It doesn't matter what your yield is, we're looking at the average yield. If the average yield is below our trigger, we will pay out. It's working in 3 irrigated systems in Leyte. And what they've done, they have a yield history, so they know the average yield expected in Allianz per hectare for these different irrigated systems, and they've all got slightly different yields. And what they do is they have a coverage level. So they say, if you want to be insured for 85% of the value of your crop, it's going to cost you 7.12% of the value of your crop. So that's the premium you have to pay. You have to pay 7% of your crop value. And if you're paying at that rate, if the average yield is below this trigger, we will pay you. So if the entire NIS gets an average yield below that, you'll get a payout of 85% of your value of your crop. But it's going to cost you 7%. So that's the premium you have to pay in advance to be covered at 85%. And you can see the coverage level varies from place to place because they've all got different yield histories. This has been operated by the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation. They're the main insurer. DABAS has been the yield identifier. They've been going out measuring the yield at the end of the season to see if you met that trigger or not. The distribution channel is the local credit cooperative. They're actually getting the insurance out there. GIZ, one of our partners, is kind of the whole project design, implementation, and oversight. And there's also information coming from NIA for some yield history. And this is really important. NIA and BAS are providing the yield history, and BAS is providing the yield data for the trigger. So that's where we come in. Can we replace this information with remote sensing-based yield information? Now, in the past, the IRRI system has actually paid out. We had 3 different NIS in 2011. This is the yield that was measured, and I'm sorry that this goes from kilos to kilograms. But this was the measured yield, converted to kilograms. This was the trigger yield, and because the measured yield was above the trigger, there was no payout. In minute, the average yield was below the trigger, so there was a payout of about 800 pesos per farmer in this particular case. In the other NIS, again, there was no payout because the average yield was above the trigger, so no payout to those farmers. So this is where we came in. How does RIICE work with IRRI? We wanted to compare the IRRI yield estimation against the RIICE yield estimation method. And because RIICE is not a recognized technology yet. We can't use it in insurance, but what we can do is run it in parallel. So they still use the old IRRI yield estimation method, but they compare IRRI yield to the RIICE yield. And the idea is to see, do we agree? Does the RIICE technology give the same result as the traditional technology? We're trying to build confidence that way to see if it's comparable. Our challenge then is to say that it's quicker, lower cost. But the first thing to say, is it actually working? Is it a comparable technology? So sarmap partner maps the RIICE area. RIICE is the partner who's monitoring the sites and giving the yield estimate. IRRI is doing the crop modeling and putting all the results on the web GIZ. And GIZ, PCIC, and others are assessing what we've done. So these are the sites where we're working again. The 3 different NIS. RIICE went out and did a lot of sampling. They did a lot of crop cuts, about 120 crop cuts in total. And that was the kind of yield, the official yield measure at the end of the year. That was the measure of the yield for each of these NIS. So there'd be about 40 crop cuts here, 40 here, and 40 down here, approximately. And that gave you your real yield at the end of the year. So they had 124 samples across these different municipalities. Some of them were inbred, some of them were hybrid, different rice varieties. In terms of the crop modeling, we didn't really care too much about that. One of the ideas of this type of crop modeling is to say there's all this variability in different varieties, different planting dates, different management. We can't capture that. What we do is use the remote sensing as a proxy for all that information. So we see how we go. And this is what we came out with. If we looked at the yield accuracy at barangay level, and this is actually a much higher level of detail than we promised in the project. The IRRI crop cut yields in the different barangays are here, and the remote sensing-based estimates of the yield are here. And when you add it up overall, the accuracy is about 85%. The agreement between the two. What we promised to deliver was yield at municipal level. So for each municipality, we would give you an average yield. And this was our target. This is what we really wanted to get to. And for the 2 municipalities that were covered by this was the IRRI crop cut estimate, and this was the remote sensing derived estimate. And the accuracy is about 92%. And that's good enough for the insurance companies. That's a high enough accuracy for them to use that information in their product. How did they actually compare? Pretty well, actually. It was a very good year. For these 2 municipalities, these were the triggers. These were the 2 yields. And if you said, if the average yield was below that, we will pay out. The IRRI yield estimates were much higher, so no payout. And the remote sensing estimates, quite close, and also agreed, no payout. So all the farmers in those municipalities didn't receive a payout from IRRI, as IRRI was the crop yield estimation method for insurance, and the remote sensing, which wasn't used in insurance, agreed. So the insurance partners were very happy. They didn't disagree, and the yield results are comparable. As I said, that's the technology part, that's the easy bit. How do you actually generate a business model out of all of that? How do you take this technology and replace what you have? How do you actually get approval for these kind of products from the Insurance Commission? All the technology is wonderful, but you have to convey it, you have to explain how it works, you have to explain the pros and cons. Technology isn't going to solve all your problems. It's not going to be a miracle solution. So you have to be very honest and very open and transparent about what you can and can't do with this kind of technology. And kind of building up confidence with these different partners is critical. We'll be rolling out soon the web GIS so we can actually disseminate the results and allow people to understand in more detail what we're actually delivering. We're still working on improving it. Although we've got 92%, we can do better, we think. We think we can get more accuracy. So we'll keep developing it. And it's quite an ambitious target. They'd like to see this being used for yield identification by the end of next year. We'll see how that goes. We're thinking we need to monitor for about 4 seasons to get a bit more confidence in our ability to do this. Does it work in the dry season? Does it work in the wet season? Does it work in other areas? I mean, we're only just looking at Leyte. We need to get the results from all our other study sites before we can really say that this is a universal method that's going to be as accurate in all these other sites. Some of the challenges about working in public-private partnership projects. There's often a bit of lack of clarity about who does what. Everyone's got different expectations. Everyone's got different timescales. A lot of the private partners are very keen to adopt a new technology. They see it as a new market opportunity. They just want to go for it in many respects. The public partners, the government, and the reinsurers, they're the ones who say, well, hold on, we have to legislate for this. We're not just going to take this technology, cross our fingers, and hope it works. We want to build trust. We want to be demonstrated, and we have to understand the whole framework in which this is going to work. That takes time. The government's really important. We have to have a lot of infrastructure to just enable this to happen on a large scale. We can't just scale this up with a private insurance company. Somebody's going to have to actually operate this monitoring system. The chances are it's not going to be an insurance company doing this. It's more likely that it'll be a government-run monitoring system. And that's where things like PRISM comes in, which is our potentially new project with the Department of Agriculture, working with Adam, to develop a monitoring system for the Philippines. Huge amount of education, training, and capacity building has to be done because it's a completely different way of measuring and monitoring yield. A lot of support in the product design. Maybe the insurance product is not just going to be a cut and paste of the old product. You have to think in a slightly different way. Are there other opportunities and ways you can use this information to develop a slightly different product? That takes time. And the whole legal regulatory framework, that's the real challenge. Those things are not quick to change in any kind of national setting. Expectations from the private sector are extremely high. When we start showing results like this, they get really excited and say, yes, we want to use this, we want to buy in, we want to do it now. And we always have to say, well, look, these results have been really encouraging, but it's just the first result. It's the first demonstration site. Let's wait until we've got a couple more years and see what happens across all the other sites. The technology part, that's been the easy bit, really. I can see all the people in the GIS like going, easy, are you kidding? Relatively easy. The technology side is quite straightforward in terms of we know the steps, we know how to get there. We've got all the different components. It's a challenge getting people to do the work in the field. It's a challenge to work out the protocols and the measurement and do it quickly. But essentially, the technology is there. We know how to do it. It's making it operational. That's the really tough thing. Scaling it up, getting it adopted. And confidence building is the real critical issue there. And right now, everybody's asking us, how much is the cost if we wanted to do this? Don't really know yet. We're still working out what's the most optimal monitoring system, what's the most optimal number of samples, how often do you need to go to the field, what equipment do you need, etc., etc. So the cost is something we're still working on, but what we do know is something about the accuracy. And this is what we've done so far. How accurate is our area estimate? How accurate is our yield? And how accurate do we hope to be in estimating areas affected by flood and drought? And that's what we know so far. We know that the yield estimates at the municipality level, which is our target, we're currently at 92, and we'll see how that goes as we do more and more tests. We know that the area estimate at field level is 85. And what happens is that when you aggregate that up, it's only going to get better. As you look at larger and larger areas, you average out the errors, and your accuracy increases. In exactly the same way as the yield accuracy increases as you go up to larger and larger units. These are our targets. This is where we want to be by the end of the project in terms of accuracy. These are quite challenging. Area, We're extremely confident that we can do this, because we've seen radar remote sensing used for this many, many times in many, many areas. Flood, we're also very confident about, because radar remote sensing is extremely good at detecting surface water. It's such a clear, strong signal that we know we can detect flooding area with high accuracy. Even right down at field level, 9 times out of 10, we can say whether the field is flooded correctly. We'll get that decision correct. Drought, that's a bit more challenging. The signature we get from a drought-affected field is not so clear as the one we get from a flood-affected. So our accuracy there is a bit lower. But these are the kind of targets that we're hoping for in the next 2 or 3 years of RIICE. So as I said, the implications for our insurance partners is that this is just the first result from the first site. The accuracy so far has been really good. When I first saw it, I thought it was actually too good to be true. So I want to see how the other ones go. But so far, so good. We're really happy. We agreed with the existing system. In the wet season of 2012, there was no payout, which is great. But we do need about 4 seasons of testing and development across different sites before we can say one way or the other whether this is something we can do. And as I said, we didn't get any flooding in 2012. Great for everyone else, not so great for me. But it's really hard for us to demonstrate this technology. We keep talking about you can use this for flood and drought damage. And we keep praying, you don't get a flood, you don't get a drought. But we can't demonstrate it unless we do. Catch 22. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, lights on, please. You might not see me. Okay, thank you very much, Andy, for the quick overview of this project. But very informative. It shows how complex the project really is. It also gives us an opportunity to realize why we are working on RIICE, how important it is as a food crop, and also the complexity of working with private and the connection between public and private partnerships, and also for reminding us the different straightforward technologies that are currently available that we could make use of. I'm sure there are a lot of gray areas that you are eager to ask Andy about, so this is your moment. Yes.
Hi, Andy. Nice presentation. I have 2 questions. So, to which degree do national statistics already use remote sensing today in their statistics? That's the first question. This is FAO secondary data, and that data comes from national institutes. To which degree national institutes already use remote sensing? And second question is, at the end of the day, we understood well the success of the project and sustainability will hinge on farmers paying the price premium, I mean the insurance premium, right? What is your experience in the field and your expectations? Is that going to be a crucial point, and to which degree are farmers willing to pay an insurance premium?
Yeah. For the first question, in Asia, at least, the only country I know that falls under IRRI's mandate for RIICE, so I'm not talking about Japan, but India is the only country I know of that has a remote sensing based RIICE mapping component within their statistical department. And that's been running for about 10 years. We don't know how much they rely on the remote sensing estimates and how much they rely on the more traditional survey estimates. When those two come together, you don't know, you don't see how it's actually used when it comes to their final end of season or end of year estimates. But they've been running it for 10 years, it's still running, so I guess it has some value. It's much more prevalent in Europe and in the US, but I still don't think it's the official area and yield estimation method. That's something I'm quite confident in saying. I don't think there's any country using this as the sole measurement method yet. The second question about willingness to pay. I know in the Philippines, I think something like 2% of farmers actually have rice crop insurance. Tiny, tiny amount. And a lot of that is down to those reasons. You don't trust it, it's too expensive, you can't get it anyway. And that's a real challenge for the distribution channels and insurance networks. They will always have to subsidize. It's always going to have to be extremely low cost. They are never going to make money out of crop insurance. I was at a wonderful seminar in Thailand a few weeks ago, and the insurance companies there were all brutally honest about this. Nobody makes money out of crop insurance, and they never will. They see it as a way into the market for other companies. They see if they can get a low-cost, effective crop insurance, it opens the door for other access to other crop. So that's the challenge for them, is to basically take that loss, take that hit, with the assumption that it's going to actually be balanced by the other opportunities they will get in the market from that. Thailand was one example in 2011, I think, when there was an extremely bad flood in central Thailand. That very same year, the government had started a new crop insurance scheme. Terrible bad luck. I mean, they were wiped out that year. The losses were 5 times the premium, so a 500% loss. And then the government went, well, we need to rethink this, and they stopped the scheme. They're restarting again this year, and they've realized that that was not a one-off, but an exceptionally bad year. And if that scheme had been in operation longer, they probably would have built up a reserve that could have taken that hit. But because it was the first year, they couldn't take the hit. And that's another thing they're really interested in, is if we're going to develop this low-cost crop insurance, we need better data. Because they often don't trust the yield statistics. They're trying to build these yield histories and then compare to what happens in the field. So you have a yield average for a municipality, and then you start taking crop cuts in that municipality, and you go, hang on, there's an extremely big difference between our well-studied sample of crop cuts and the survey estimates that come out every year. So they're trying to think of other ways to develop a yield history. Remote sensing could have a role to play in that, because we have enough historical data to try to come up with a better yield estimate. That's also going to help them produce lower cost premiums. That's the problem they have now, the uncertainty. The risk is so high that their premiums are quite high. If they can reduce that uncertainty, they can offer lower premiums. Sorry, that was a very long answer to a very short question.
Okay, any other questions?
And we assuming that the project's already finished and people have, especially farmers, have adopted this one. Whose main responsibility will it be in terms of providing the information needed? Because right now you are working on this one, but after the project is finished, because they need those information.
Yeah, there are 2 options. PRISM is one. If the Department of Agriculture sustains and supports the PRISM RIICE information system that we're working on right now, and that would provide exactly that kind of yielded area information. There has to be a discussion then in how does the government provide that to the insurance companies? You know, how do they get access to that information? So that's one option. The other would be to have a collaboration between the public and private insurance companies in the Philippines. So PCIC is the public, it's the government-backed insurance, and you have insurance companies like Pioneer who are also interested in this. And if they see that there's enough potential, they would be willing to financially support this kind of system. Because right now they have to pay others anyway to generate the yield history, to generate the crop cut information. So they're already paying providers for information.
That's for the Philippines.
For the Philippines. In every country it's different. That's the big challenge we've discovered in RIICE. The different legislation, the different partnerships. Some countries have only public insurance, some countries only have private insurance, some have both. Trying to work out how to collaborate with those different partners is very challenging. We've got a lot of interest in Vietnam already, and it will be the same kind of system. We will work with the insurance companies, and they would be the ones to pay and support that kind of system. Thailand, there's also a lot of interest, but there I think it would be more of a national system. With the government and the Remote Sensing Institute there being extremely interested in running this kind of system. It's part of their mandate to map and monitor RIICE. So we're trying to find partners and institutes who already have this role to provide this kind of information, but to try and see if we can give them technology to just do it better and to do it more quickly.
Okay, any other question? Okay, so I guess this wraps things up. Thank you, Andy.
Welcome.